I'll give the official start of this panel. Good evening, and welcome after a day-long presentations and discussions, and hopefully some fun times too. Before I introduce our speakers, I would like to say a few words about the content of this panel. It's about migration. Yes, and migration has become a prominent topic in the public sphere, dominating political campaigns and debates, as we know. But unfortunately, most often, this dominant political discourse sees migration as a problem, as a threat that needs to be fixed by different sort of policies. The more repressive variant of this discourse would suggest tighter border controls. The more so-called liberal ones would focus on the root causes of migration, but sometimes only to violence or the conflict in the origins, so people do not come. So either way, mostly the problematizations and the solutions to migration leads to unproductive debates and sometimes disheartening feelings. Well, in this panel, I hope to create a dialogue between migration scholars and the degrowth community, so that maybe we can find a synergy in this collaboration to find a different path to the issue of migration. You found all our speakers' biographies in your online programs, so I'm not going to repeat them all. I introduce you guys by names: Miriam Lang, Martin Lemberg-Pedersen, Malin, McGlinn, and Islar is mine as the chair. So we all have names starting with M. So this is going to be the, M session, M show on migration. So just for the structure, you all have 20 minutes for your talks. And after these 20 minutes, we will have maybe 10 to 15 minutes discussion, like basically responding to each other. And afterwards, we will open up the debate for the audience and take your questions. So I would like to start with you, Miriam, since you're very familiar with the degrowth community. And I want to ask you, why do you think migration is relevant for degrowth, and what type of opportunities or challenges it poses for degrowth vision?
Okay. Hello, good evening to everybody. Thank you very much, Mine, and thank you very much to the organizing group for having me here. I've actually come a long way from Ecuador, where I'm currently living, and have been much more engaged with migration in a former part of my life when I was still living in Germany. And I will try to make those bridges between degrowth and migration, although it was a hard piece of work to fit it into 20 minutes. I'll do my best. And I decided to do it more from a political activist stance than an academic one. I think that's more useful for this space. So migration is at the core of the struggle about the world we want to live in. It currently calls into question the ethical foundations of societies in the global north. But migration today is also a symptom of a multidimensional civilizational crisis, one symptom. And this crisis also becomes manifest, for example, in the accelerated destruction of the material and ecological conditions of life, or in the crisis of liberal electoral democracy, or in the rise of right-wing populisms and religious fundamentalisms, or in the rise of patriarchal violence and violent criminal economies, and of course in an unprecedented, scandalous level of inequality in the world. So this crisis, from my point of view, is rooted in the very basis of modern Western capitalist civilization, which is not only founded in the centrality of economic growth, of course also, but also in domination along the axis of class, race, and gender, in predatory relations with nature, and in the role we have assigned to scientific knowledge and technology to find solutions for the upcoming problems. Degrowth is one of the main narratives, as you all know, which in the face of this crisis call for a profound paradigmatic change. As I view degrowth, it originally arose from concerns around the limitedness of resources, around sustainability and resource justice, as well as a growing malaise with 21st century capitalism within the societies of the global north. And I know that this global south, global north dichotomy is only, well, it's simplifying, but it's still useful. In this more cultural dimension, degrowth also engages in the reconstruction of collective, solidarian, and sustainable social practice against the principles of individualization, competitiveness, and profit maximization. And I think those collective spaces of experimentation, those practices around degrowth, are extremely important in the face of the rise of racist, nationalist, and fascist movements who promote fears that migration would represent a threat to welfare and wealth in the global north. Because where degrowth builds political communities, it becomes possible to collectively learn and practically experience, and this is very important, that modes of living which promote perspectives of well-being that are not centered on consumption and material accumulation do not necessarily mean a loss, but also can give rise to a whole new quality of human relations and social embeddedness. However, it is amazing that not even now, in the face of a migration crisis of historical dimensions, the main debates around migration in Europe, I follow more the debates in Germany, but I guess it's more or less similar, focuses on what really happens in those world regions where people are expelled from, or on what we must do to prevent their expulsion. On the contrary, perpetuating Eurocentrism, the debate managed to frame migration as a crisis of the global north, as a governance crisis, as a cultural crisis of bearing capacities, or as a crisis of welfare systems. So, while migration activists struggle against walling up borders and for the integration of migrants here, which is, of course, very important, dealing with the root causes of migration, and I not only refer to those root causes which are catastrophic or framed as exceptional, like wars, natural disasters, etc., but the everyday root causes of migration is left to politicians and big international NGOs, who superficially frame it like the dealing with those root causes in terms of development aid. And I think development aid is one of the most harmful kinds of North-South relations, not only since it has been associated with externalizing even the walling up of Europe to countries of Africa, for example, but it already was harmful before that. So I think that today, defending the rights of people to stay where they come from in the global south and live a life in dignity there is at least as important as defending the right to free movement. So one challenge certainly is to develop strategies around those root causes of migration. Migration reminds us of the destruction that the externalization of the social and ecological costs of our mode of living causes to peripheral regions, mainly in the global south, but also in Eastern Europe, for example. That the meat that we eat, the cars that we drive, the electronic devices that we use, the planes that we fly, etc., directly contribute to the accelerated destruction of livelihoods somewhere else. And I'm not only talking about environmental destruction of material conditions of reproduction, but also about the destructions of forms of social organization, of cultural systems of belonging, of forms of making sense of the world, because it leaves territories to extreme forms of patriarchal violence and enemy in some ways. So we could say that migration physically brings back some of the costs of this imperial mode of living, to use the term that Ulrich Brandt and Markus Wissen have coined, back to the capitalist centers. So the truth is that if we really seek a good life for all, as the degrowth movement states, including the global south, we also must call into question, I think, our understandings of welfare. the welfare state, as it has existed during some decades in some countries of the North, before it was then intervened by neoliberal structural adjustment and shrunk, was a historical exception. Its conditions of possibility were, for example, that workers' struggles were more successful as they took place under the specific conditions of the Cold War, while cheap oil prices intensified the appropriation of cheap labor and nature from the global South. This welfare state model, which supposedly is now under threat because of migration, has never been ecologically sustainable nor globally just. It consisted in generalizing mass consumption, as we will remember, considerably intensifying the flows of matter and energy. So it has never been possible to generalize this model globally, although this is precisely what the promise of development offers to the South. We also should remind that welfare state always was a patriarchal arrangement which has driven women into the dependency of men and enabled the state to establish paternalistic conditionalities for the access to welfare. So I think that today we cannot ignore these downsides of the Fordist welfare model, even if after having experienced privatization and deregulation, it somehow appears to us to have been the highest stage human civilization ever reached. Our task consists in generating other forms of collective well-being, which would be truly generalizable to all and built on sustainable nation relations. And also to imagine other roles for the state within these new welfare or well-being arrangements. In order to really promote a good life for all, including people in peripheries, it is necessary to envision the capitalist world system as a whole. We have to focus much more on the interdependency between global North and global South, and to understand that the transformation of the global North depends on the transformation in the South, and most importantly, the transformation in the South will only be possible if we really manage to transform effectively our modes of living and power relations in the global North. Some voices within degrowth, of course, have touched this debate. For example, Serge Latouche, Juan Martínez Alier, Ulrich Brandt, Alberto Acosta, and have already promoted alliances between degrowth in the North and post-extractivism in the South. And of course, now in 2 weeks, we will have the first North-South degrowth conference in Mexico, which is good. But there are still degrowthers who state that countries of the South might have a certain right to grow, thus reinforcing the dominant narrative of catch-up development, where the underdeveloped South has still not fully reached the benefits of capitalist modernity, as it has remained on a former stage in a supposed linear history of progress. They ignore that growth in the global South generally takes the shape of mining, industrial monocultures, or oil extraction, precisely because of the differentiated roles assigned to regions in the world system, and that there is nothing positive to that, at least never to the local populations. It is true that there are many actors who do claim the right to growth for the countries of the South, yes, especially government representatives, for example, at the climate conferences, because they are inevitably aligned with the development paradigm. They take their legitimacy from there, yeah? But there are also peoples who still go on building their own histories at the margins of modern colonial capitalism, and who are not so much advocating for a paradigmatic change like degrowthers, but they are simply organizing their lives in a radically different way on the basis of other civilizational paradigms, other political ontologies, that is, other ways of simply being in the world and interpreting it. And from my point of view, these are the natural allies of the degrowth movement in the South. The defense and preservation of this still existing epistemic and ontological plurality of societies in the global south is complementary to the recreation of political communities in the north, as both show that other worlds are possible in very practical and contemporary and not only theoretical or utopian terms. Those societies I refer to are often indigenous or peasant, mostly rural, but sometimes also urban, when they migrated as a community, and they are in many ways dysfunctional to capital and the world market. They are organized around the quality of relations, both between humans and of humans with non-human forms of life. And equilibrium in these relations is their highest good, while accumulation is seen as something negative. Their existence is not framed by the exploitation of resources, by cost-benefit calculations or goals of productivity and competitiveness, nor by the capacity to accumulate. Certainly, those societies are marginal today, yes, full of contradictions, and their mere existence is under threat because of the constant pressure of extractivist destruction on their territories. Nevertheless, we should not see them only as victims and frame our solidarity in terms of transfer of resources and knowledge, repeating the paternalistic gesture of development aid. Instead, we should recognize them as political actors whose struggles are contemporaneous and interdependent with ours, and whose knowledges are making important contributions in the face of the current civilizational crisis. Not only have they managed to preserve biodiversity so far, they also have long-standing experience with diverse forms of democracy, which might help us to find paths out of the crisis of liberal electoral democracy. They also have developed forms to produce well-being collectively and for all, even in absence of the state, which might be important when engaging in a dialogue about reinventing welfare. We generally perceive those radically other paths to collective well-being as residual, marginal, local, backward, underdeveloped. And often if someone refers to them in a positive way, we think this only can be idealization. This is the result of a specific geopolitics of knowledge which actively produces their achievements as irrelevant. But I insist, of course, they are permeated by lots of contradictions, deformations, because of all the struggles they're also involved in. And because, they are imperfect as everyone. All those peoples I'm talking about are systematically classified as poor by the standardized poverty indicators like income poverty or consumption poverty, precisely because their modes of living are dysfunctional to capitalist markets. So you don't use much money, you're poor, regardless of the land you have, the water you use, etc., for example. That says absolutely nothing about their subjective well-being, but it is precisely what qualifies them as strategic allies of degrowth. In order to engage in a strategic struggle together with people from this global south, to build a new way of internationalism, we must openly face these mechanisms which declare all their contributions irrelevant and prone to eradication. We must engage in cognitive justice and welfare justice alongside with environmental justice and climate justice. We must face the coloniality of power and knowledge and actively help deconstruct the development paradigm, because growth is not exactly the same as development, although they are closely associated, because the development paradigm still has this humiliating, subjectivating effect that you are underdeveloped, regardless of all the euphemisms that have been invented since then. We also must resist the attempts of 21st century capitalism to reframe transformation only as individual consumer choices around personal health and wellness, for example. And we must address the structural conditions which sustain those unequal exchanges. So solidarity in the 21st century, for example, would need all those campaigns and networks that attempt to stop concrete environmental destruction or specific conditions of labor exploitation, targeting concrete corporations, for example, or concrete territories. Strategies aiming at giving southern actors new leeway for action against unjust transnational rules, the whole WTO complex and free trade. And also deconstructing the appeal of the imperial mode of living to not only the people here, but also to the middle classes of the global south. Through cultural change, but also showing what is our malaise with being included in this imperial mode of living, what is not working well, why people are not happy here, which is always made invisible in all the tales about the global north that circulate in the global south. Even migrants contribute to this invisibility by sending money and inventing stories of their success in the countries they have migrated to, because it's just so important for their dignity to do that. So basically, from my point of view, these would be important paths for political action of the degrowth movement in relation with migration.
Thanks. You very much. Thank you, Miriam. So now let's move to our next speaker, Martin Lemberg-Pedersen. Okay, he wants clapped.
Oh, I was thirsty, sorry. Well, first I want to thank the organizers and Mine for inviting me to contribute to this panel. I'll play the part of the more academic perspective and a migration scholar, as that is my profession. Also, I'm a philosopher, so maybe I will focus more on the sort of the knowledge part that Miriam also touched upon. I'm going to do this in 4 stages. First, I'm going to set the stage by talking about the discourses and politics that surround migration today. Then I'm going to talk about blasts from the recent past. And that'll lead towards the more post-colonial and political economic analysis, which has to do with the political economy of modern or current border control. And then finally, post-colonial trajectories when it comes to European migration control and humanitarianism, which also, I hope, links up to some of what Miriam was saying. So first off, well, most of you, and as Mine also said in her introduction, are familiar with the state of European and indeed Western migration politics today. It is incredibly polarized. It is quite a toxic climate. There are fierce debates. We have a lot of fear and politics of insecurity, politics of fear and insecurity. Some of these revolve around rather generic demographic arguments about swamping, right? That means, I come from Denmark, but I know this to be the case in other countries as well. The arrival of immigrants is seen as gradually outnumbering local nationals. That's the demographic swamping argument. I'll return to that. You know it in different varieties. Also, it's beset with discourses on increasingly anti-integration. That is a political wish to prevent integration. Not just to say that it's difficult, but to actually impose politics that prevent it. That is actually segregationist, and I think it is worth pointing out that this is happening in countries like Denmark, also Sweden, Germany, by certain political parties as well. There are also racialized discourses, and of course there is, at least in migration studies, a debate about the application of racialization theory to the many different groups of people targeted by these kind of rhetorics. I'm not going to go into it, but I'm just going to assume we can talk about how it manifests itself in in terms of different groups. And of course, we see a resurgence of nationalistic ideology, which has to do with, that has a lot to do, and I don't have time to go into it right now, but a lot to do with how the realism of political proposals are assessed, and whether or not they need to be realistic for certain parties to propose rather stark measures, which I think is also dominating European politics. Then most of you will have heard about the Frontex agency. By now, this is the European Union's agency responsible for controlling the Union's outer borders. You'll have heard of search and rescue missions in the Mediterranean and all the controversies that are happening right now, right these days, about the Italian government refusing to accept ships with displaced people and persons in need. You will have heard about the ramping up of deportation politics. This is also something I've looked rather a lot into, specifically when it comes to unaccompanied minors, which several European countries wants to deport to Afghanistan. Somalia is another case in point. But this, of course, also revolves around adults or families with children also targeted for deportation. Finally, you have, just to sum up a very quick run-through, you'll have heard of externalizations. Miriam mentioned the concept in terms of social and economic costs. In migration and border studies, there's a distinct category, which is the externalization of border control. That's simply the export beyond European territory of control measures to other countries in order to preempt migration en route to Europe. This is why it's actually more accurately called migration control, as these are persons that haven't crossed any European borders yet. The border, the control is preemptive. And that happens, one case in point is the EU-Turkey deal. Turkey now has, by some estimates, around 4 million displaced persons, contained and kept back from moving onwards to Europe. The European and Italian collaboration with Libya, which has been ongoing for more than 20 years, but is mutated into very severe forms of exploitation and slavery lately. It was also terrible during Gaddafi. Also, there are to regions of Sahel and Horn of Africa, EU attempts to externalize border control. Lately to Sudan, where rapid support forces, which was earlier known as Janjaweed and accused of genocide, are now receiving money through the Sudanese government in order to contain what is one of the world's largest evolving refugee crises right now. All of this is framed within a dominant epistemology. One that really, when you look at it, is beset with contradictions and inconsistencies. Right now, I'll refer to it as a certain grammar of displacement. And the task I set up myself for the rest of the talk is to try and deconstruct this grammar. Where does it come from? What is its material and historical underpinnings, so that we may actually try to understand how we can create a different way of talking and knowing about migration than the one that structures these very unsustainable policies that I've just described. A first step in doing that is to recognize that these are blasts from the past. It's not exactly new policies. The deal with Turkey may be new, but attempts and visions to externalize border control and camps is not. I've done some research into a version of this. There are several. I want to point out that UNHCR camps in regions of origin, that's also externalization. You can also argue that it's externalizing migration control. But the ones I'm talking about are visions more specifically, not about protection, but about containment. And there we find that back in 1986, the Danish government proposed certain ideas to stop all asylum seeking on the European territory and isolate it in camps in North Africa or Eastern Europe. They framed this as a humanitarian solution to a protection system that was broken. Then a Dutch government in 1993 sort of rehashed the proposal. Both were rejected, shut down. And then the Tony Blair's Labour government in 2003 revived it, supported by Denmark and Netherlands, and they called it a new vision for refugees. But these were variations of the very same externalization: stop for asylum seeking and deport people back to camps outside Europe. All of them failed, but they're not new, and now they're back with a vengeance. We've heard the Turkey deal presented as regional protection elsewhere. So the protection elsewhere framing is one within refugee law and migration studies, and the Turkey deal may be seen as one instantiation of it. Right now, these days, the EU leaders, in their infinite wisdom, has proposed what they label regional disembarkation platforms. They're very eager to emphasize that it shouldn't be called camps, although there might be a certain encampment component to the policy. What this means in the EU's terminology is that boat migrants intercepted, such as the ones that I talk about with search and rescue, they have to be administratively deported straight back to camp-ish structures in North Africa. This does sound quite familiar, right? And basically there they will have their asylum case assessed, although there will be no commitment from European countries to resettle those who get a positive reply. So, as we can see, there is a direct trajectory from the recent past. Some scholars, Etienne Balibar and others, have talked about a recolonization of European politics, because such camps impose the very difficult problem of who has the sovereignty to secure rights and adequate standards in such facilities. Especially given over this summer it has been repeated that all North African countries have said, no, we are not interested in it. They've categorically refused becoming what they call the trash bin of Europe's unwanted. I think the fact that we can witness this policy over such a long span of time, and the fact that it's been unsuccessful, probably because of its unrealism, also has to do, or it shows us that what it's actually solving, or attempting to solve, is not a problem out there. It is the internal stalemate, the internal conflict between European countries. Basically, since the 1980s, even earlier, the European countries have not been able to reach a common agreement on how to distribute responsibility and so-called, I don't like to use it, it's called burden sharing. I prefer to talk about responsibility sharing, right? No such agreement has been reached, and so externalization policies, they're really a way of exporting the problem, making a corner kick out of it. It's something which can be sold to domestic voters that certain political parties and governments seek to cater to. It's not something that can be sold to the countries in those regions. They always refuse them. So we have to assess the ideological component behind this policy drive, because that helps explain why certain of these policies, even if wildly unrealistic and certainly problematic, are still attempted pursued. Now the camps, as I said, the specific proposals, they were rejected all 3 times, and so far also today. But that doesn't mean that versions of them haven't been pursued. Indeed, this can be seen as the EU policy towards Gaddafi's Libya through the 2000s, where a string of camps basically were functioning as concentration camps, in that they were rounding up and containing certain segments of migrants deemed en route to Europe. And these camps and the associated infrastructure was funded by the EU. So again, the regional disembarkation platforms today may not be realistic, but that doesn't mean that certain, I think, multilateral coalitions aren't going to pursue it, either bilaterally or as a group, and that does not bode well. Now I'm going to move on to talk more about border control and the political economy behind it, because what I've sketched might give the impression that, all these closed borders, if we look at a dichotomy between open and closed borders, you'll have the, die-hard cosmopolitan proposing open borders, then you'll have the nationalist proposing closed borders, and then the nationalism is so much on the rise that this is explaining externalization. And of course, that's one component why we're seeing this, but I think there are other interests at stake as well. For instance, that borders themselves have increasingly or are increasingly becoming sites of massive profit. So some estimates, which is Frost and Sullivan, themselves an actor in this industry I'm about to sketch, have estimated that the borders in the global in the world will reach a value of $50 billion by 2020. What does this mean? This means that we're seeing certain drives to privatize border control. Namely, in terms, in a chapter I wrote, I distinguished between enforcement and infrastructure contracts. So how does this privatization actually happen? Well, it happens that certain actors like G4S or Serco, they are contracted to operate the enforcement of borders. In the UK, for instance, most of the asylum centers are actually run like in prison standards by security guards employed by G4S. In Australia, G4S was also very active, and in a bidding war with Serco as to housing, deporting, transporting, and even assessing asylum seekers' cases. But there are also infrastructure contracts. And in a way you can say this has always been the case, that's true, but what we're seeing is at least a drive to boost specific kinds of infrastructures today, which were not the norm, say 30 or 20 years ago. This kind of actors I'm talking about are the more conventional, what is known as the military-industrial complex perhaps, or military-industrial weapons providers, such as Leonardo, French, that's Italian, French Thales, German Airbus, formerly Danish Accenture. They are competing in a very volatile debt financing economy where it's a capital-intensive one, and they also reap a lot of money from, for instance, EU when it comes to research and development, R&D, into border control technologies. What we're seeing is also that behind these actors, there is a financial sector. Barclays, Bank of Scotland, UniCredit, European investment banks are all posting money into research and development and other kinds of loans to this sector, which then heralds a systemic shift towards neoliberalization practices. You see blurred boundaries between public and private interests. You see lobbyism and revolving doors where certain actors are hired, and from ministries to banks to weapons companies to export credit agencies and back again, resulting in multi-level governance of borders. And so externalization becomes, in this optic, a very profitable export market for a European arms industry which has suffered since the end of the Cold War. Okay, I'm gonna, since Mina signaled there's not enough, a lot of time back, I'm gonna finish off talking about the post-colonial trajectories in this. First of all, this context that I've just sketched to you is one that is lacking from the dominant epistemology of displacement that I started out describing. It is depoliticized in that sense. And this is unfortunately also the case, I think, for refugee studies, forced migration studies in general. And so it means that the sort of solutions prescribed as durable solutions, they become sort of palliative, periodic responses to more systemic conditions which yield cyclical occurrences of displacement. But the root causes, the everyday root causes, they remain unaddressed because they are a result of the political economic system at a global scale of which the border control industry and the financial sector is part. Now, the post-colonial trajectory to that is I think we need to go and look at the birth of the capitalist system, at least what facilitated the capitalist system, and I'm working on the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade as a prime example of this. How when sugar was king and cotton became king, rum was king as well, how a commodities change, these industries were created that really boosted both industrialization in European context, but also created a range of export and import markets located around this colonial and imperial grid. We see Saint-Domingue, the French crown jewel of the empire, reaping immense profits by the end of the 1700s until the slave rebellion set in and the state of Haiti was born. And that crept in as a sort of a permanent fear into the European minds when it came to the demographic argument that I started out with. Because the paradoxical case when it came to the slave islands, there are numerous others, of course, in the Caribbean than Saint-Domingue, was that it was the profit, the desire for profits, which led the plantation economy to import more and more slaves to the extent that they themselves became a demographic minority in the sugar colonies. So you see that the same kind of discourse is repeated in today's political environment without any attention to the political economy which created the problems today, which creates the displacement. So in the end, what we end up with, and I'll finish with that, is that the grammar of displacement I'm talking about is inherently racialized because the violence, the way it represents violence, is by omitting the original causes of displacement and turning the very process of movement of certain people into acts of violence themselves. The polarization, racialization we see in European countries today is depicting the very presence of so-called illegals as disruptive events. The excessive and almost obsessive weather forecast of how many have arrived, how many asylum seekers, how many cross the Mediterranean now, are rehearsals and meditations over what is perceived as violence events, disruptions of the European order. But of course, that's only possible if one assumes the peaceful order to legitimately include the violent displacement and dispossession of people in what can be called the global south. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you very much, Martin. Now we move to our last speaker, Malin, McGlinn. Malin's work concerned with the local governance of migration, and I know Degrowth community is so much into, studying the local, studying the communities. So I would like to really know how is possible in the age of migration to create inclusive communities in the cities or in the studies that you're making.
Yes. Can you hear me? Yes, you can hear me? Perfect. Hi. Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be here. I got stung by a bee before coming here, so I don't feel too well. If anyone has any antihistamine, please give it to me. But I'll try to pull this off. Yeah, we'll do it later. Yeah, so I'm going to go local. I'm going to talk about what we do in the name of trying to be inclusive. And I'll let you know a few things that I found problematic, and then hopefully we can together discuss a few possible ways forward. So I'm just going to give you a short backdrop to my research. It's in a dissertation that I defended in March, so it's not that long ago. I'm a very new doctor. So, oh, thank you, lovely, so kind. So my research is concerned with how the governing of unemployment and social exclusion in Malmö was accomplished through labor market projects that were initiated, tailored, and co-financed by the European Social Fund. So these projects, so-called ESF projects, you might have heard of them, are by the European Union described as Europe's main tool for promoting employment and social inclusion. And the goal is to help so-called disadvantaged people into society and to ensure fairer life opportunities for all. So when I read this, when I started my PhD, it got me very interested to follow these projects about empirically and say, what did they do? What were they about? So I followed them about through, project descriptions, applications, budgets, promotional material. And my aim was kind of to find out how this will to empower so-called ethnic others and practices such as ESF projects that describe themselves as being very inclusive has become both a way of attracting research grants and other types of funding, and a way of legitimatizing knowledge production that favors certain research method in which the other is the object of study. So I'm going to give you a few conclusions that I drew in my dissertation, and then I'll hopefully, maybe we can discuss it later, possible ways of getting out of this bad situation that I believe that we are in. So I'm going to give you like a few conclusions under 3 headings, and I'm going to be pedagogical and tell you the headings first. So the first one is the construction of disempowerment. And the second one is the administration of compassion and what I call neoliberal charity. And the third one is techniques of containment and what I call inclusive marginalization. So first then, the construction of disempowerment and what I mean by this in my research. So based on the descriptions of the project participants in these applications, as well as of the problems that these projects try to solve, I drew a few conclusions. First, that these ESF projects in Malmö supplied local bodies of governance with a way of dealing with unemployed individual migrants. On the one hand, this created a direct link between immigration and unemployment. On the other hand, however, it made it possible to avoid addressing the link between immigration and unemployment, other in terms of individual shortcomings and lacking personal traits. Second, the framings of the problem related to unemployment affirm that discrimination is often dealt with at the level of some compensatory measures involving those suffering from discrimination. Those who were labored, excluded from employment, were encouraged to engage in their own empowerment in order to combat discrimination based on ethnicity. So just as the linkage between immigration and unemployment was left untouched and at the same time reinforced, so was the linkage between so-called non-Swedish ethnicity and discrimination. Third, I found that the repetition of problem representations connected to certain groups of people and spaces indicated that the word immigrant and, for example, Rosengård, which is an area in Malmö, over time have become words that can be attached to other words in order to connote problems. And in this case, also as a way of accessing funding from the European Social Fund. As a result, financial aid becomes associated with immigrants from Rosengård and other areas. Unemployment can thus, through an imaginary and oft reinforced kind of reversal, be explained and conceptualized by referring to migration or to Rosengård. Are you with me? The words that are used to describe certain spaces, thus, in the words of Batten, effectively influence the way we think about those realities. Through this process, some people and the spaces they inhabit become deeply associated with unemployment, and as a result, how we act towards, through, and upon them. And I believe this is what the scholar Sara Ahmed means by sticky associations. Hence the nearness of the words, and this came unemployment, migration, and Rosengård, for instance, does the work of argument without actually having to make the argument. And in this process, I believe that attention is drawn away from the fact that these all deprived areas, again in the words of Batten, are the spatial outcomes of growing social and economic inequalities. Unemployment or unemployability, to use a popular word used by the European Union, was framed and represented to be the result of behavioral rather than economic factors. Economic marginalization, for instance unemployment, could thus be explained by referring to presumed culture, ethnic, or religious restraints. So the narrative that I find that is constructed in some of these applications that I've studied is that project participants are, prisoners of their own traditions, and they're not conducting themselves as they should, and they're like sitting at home, not earning a living, and they are lacking proper and, by Swedish standards, validated education. So this, for me, signals that the idea that intervention into the life of those who are thought to be exercising the wrong kind of freedom can be justified without making explicit reference to ethnicity or culture. Instead, the presumed limitations of certain groups can be implied by referring to things as gender inequality or the lack of democracy, connoting some of the same anti-modern backwardness. So these ESF projects are depicted as vehicles for empowerment and hope for marginalized immigrants living in deprived areas. And through these projects, the participant can not only make the transition from unemployable to employable, but can also become decent and modern Swedish citizens. So according to my analysis then, these projects can also be viewed as very, colonial modernity projects that successfully construct people as disempowered and thus in need of salvation. And this brings me to my other point, this administration of compassion and the neoliberal charity. For I suggest that the production and administration of compassion and pity is at the core of the ESF project machinery and the project it sets in motion in Sweden. And by compassion, I mean, following Newcomb, a feeling of sympathy for the suffering for another with a desire to alleviate that other's suffering. As the material that I've studied makes clear, pity for certain groups is invoked by describing them as lacking something, knowledge about wellness, democracy, equality, or the right skills to be employable. This lack is something that is described as a result of other non-European cultures. So the colonial descriptions of people, which connote this certain anti-modern lifestyle and are framed in what I called an acceptable racial grammar, justifies pity for the suffering. This in turn calls for individual measures such as vocational training and empowerment workshops, and in addition makes it possible to legitimize the increased focus on the responsibility of individuals. The irony is that being inclusive then means identifying a group on whose behalf pity is invoked without actually transforming that pity into measures that question the basis of exclusion. Instead, being inclusive means making individuals responsible for the situation in which they are in. And since the ESF system, and this is the very cynical part I think, is premised on the conversion of social benefits into co-financing, that's the core of the economic system, this means that the will to empower the other also becomes a strategy for securing ESF funding. So the perfect marriage between the administration of compassion and pity for those suffering from unemployment and social exclusion and the market economy that needs the suffering in order to attract the funding, and this is the phenomenon that I call neoliberal charity. And that for me seems to be the basic constituency and logic of the ESF economy. Lastly, in my thesis, I suggest that the framing of the reasons for unemployment is also connected to what the aforementioned Ahmed calls affective techniques of containment. And by this she means processes of truth-making, in which certain judgments about others, in her case subaltern women, become effective mechanisms for regulating social life. And Ahmed argues that fear works as a mechanism to secure truths through the narration of crisis, and furthermore how fear sticks to somebody's bodies and not to others. So picking up then from what I said earlier, I argue that compassion and pity work in a similar way. Through the administration of compassion, and by that I mean recalculating social benefits, measuring and evaluating if people feel closer to the labor market, and translating bad feeling into good feeling by showing up happy project workers on a kind of like a catwalk. The ESF way of governing contributes to a containment of a certain way of regulating social life for so-called unemployable others. In my view, this loop of common sense making, in which certain judgments and problems and representations and classifications serve as techniques for containing certain truths about people, and I think paradoxically that is facilitated by both the political left and the political right. Compassion as an effective technique of containment can be said to be the response to fear as another effective technique of containment. Compassion versus fear, the left versus the right, and inclusion versus exclusion. Nevertheless, I argue, what remains in both cases is still the other is still constructed as the other. Both sides, I think, of the political spectrum can be said to be engaging in what Fasan and others call the biopolitics of otherness, meaning that they single out immigrants as a calculable group in a statistical phenomenon, and in doing so, contribute to the reproduction of the base for exploitation. Seen through one lens, helping and wanting to do good for those determined as the suffering ones, whether it's a visibly poor person in public space or starving children, and those are, could see as good feelings. I think that feeling empathy for fellow humans is essential for democracy to function, and compassion from this aspect can be seen as the antidote to a selfish and very individualistic political and economic system. And on an emotional and personal level, I agree with this. But my analysis is not on the level of personal and emotional empathy. Instead, I'm very inspired by Arendt, and I suggest that compassion and group-based pity directs attention to those suffering, but not to the systems that produce the suffering. And this, in Arendt's mind, is a difference between actions of compassion and actions of solidarity. So suffering might arouse solidarity, but it's not guided by it. So her analysis holds, and I agree with her, that seeking justice, rather than just seeking to help individuals, results in the long-term just society. In other words, we shouldn't settle for what in my dissertation I call inclusive marginalization. And by this I mean a way of governing that doesn't challenge the fundaments, the rationalities and technologies for which inequalities are produced, but instead only tweaks this system and inequality in a slightly more inclusive way. So I have a few suggestions, well, maybe not, but how do we move forward then if this is the system? I think we need to maybe shift away from what Fraser calls affirmative remedies to transformative remedies, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So affirmative remedies to injustices, they focus on, and I quote, correcting inequitable outcomes of social arrangements without disturbing the underlying framework that generates them. In contrast, transformative remedies aims at restructuring the underlying framework that produces these injustices. In other words, we have to shift away, I think, of focusing on helping individual migrants to instead address the link between migration and unemployment. I suggest that the ESF way of governing can be seen as a system that facilitates and produces both affirmative recognition and affirmative redistribution, and then creating these vicious circles of mutually reinforcing cultural and economic subordination. I think we have to deal with both. So to break these circles, I think we need to ask the hard and very complex question and not be satisfied with this status quo. Second, I think that it's important to acknowledge that while complying with racializing or colonial practices is not the same as being a racist, but by being institutionalized, it can be just as harmful if not systematically more so. There is, of course, a difference between a racial grammar and a racist grammar. Racializing statements are not the same as racist statements. And I believe that most people who use a racial grammar, a grammar that is inherently colonial, we, and I include myself here, we don't think of ourselves as being racist, but that doesn't mean that we're not contributing to upholding these racializing practices. And I believe that, you know, part of the problem is you have to acknowledge that there is one. And I think that if we continue to think that racism and racist practices are something that bad people feel and do, instead of acknowledging that it's an institutional practice that we're all part of, you know, that's what we need to do. We can't just point at Sverigedemokraterna. So I'm going to come to conclusion here. I believe that the ways in which the ESF project machine is constructed and promoted, from the ways that project funding is arranged and the project labor market is created, to the celebrations of corporations like IKEA, who are awarded for being inclusive and for taking so-called social corporate social responsibility, I think it disguises and blinds us from seeing and critiquing that this project machinery is part of what Acker calls inequality regimes. And by this she means the interrelated practices, processes, actions and meanings that result in and maintain class, gender and race inequalities. The truth-making about certain people from other cultures that constitutes these inequality regimes, they don't change merely through the change of semantics, calling someone a project participant instead of a welfare recipient. And such a regime, they cannot be challenged if they're dependent economically and symbolically on disempowered, unemployable subjects to function. In addition, when such regimes are, as they often are in Sweden, legitimatized through the racial grammar of inclusion and tolerance, and stem from very good intention of wanting to help those on whose behalf we feel sorry, then in my view, they can become very easily, as in the ESF economy, neoliberalism's best friend, that you make money under suffering. And if this is the case, I argue that maybe it's better to be alone than in really bad company. I also think that rather than taking a certain language and intention at face value, I believe that certain problem representations need to be dismantled in order to open up for problematizations as the basis for critique. Another way of putting this would be to say that if inclusion operates normatively to the point at which it can never be questioned based on what it actually does, then it can then serve as the basis for a depoliticization of precisely the issues that it's trying to address. I believe that this is the point that we are in Sweden and probably elsewhere. I'm sure there are many people from different countries here. But a point at which certain practices of inclusion, and in my thesis then represented by these ESF projects, are seen as the antidote to some infected political discussion about diversity and multiculturalism. Compassion is seen as a cure to an explicit anti-immigration agenda put forward by some parties at on the political right. And empowerment is understood as the opposite of domination and as a tool for giving those termed excluded back their voices. I believe our chances of producing a socially just society would be improved if we scrutinize practices that are made possible through the invocation of inclusion, and as a result questioned whether they had really led to economic and social justice, or if they, as suggested by Brown, function merely as some kind of therapeutic and behavioral projects for certain people. In conclusion then, I think that the tendency within the political debate about diversity and multiculturalism in Sweden is that all political parties, more or less, partake in practices of constructing the ethnic other into passive objects to be governed. This tendency is also prevalent within academia, I think, where the gaze is often directed to ethnic others instead of to the system that produces ethnic other as either a burden to deal with or save, or as a symbolic trope to show off. And I think that one of the most alarming outcomes of avoiding the similarities between racists, racializing practices, and multiculturalism is that it hinders the emergence of a politics capable of countering extreme racism. In my view, the first step to solving a problem is to acknowledge that there is one. And I think this requires serious self-reflection, also by those who think of themselves as being inclusive. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Malin. Do you still need how do you feel?
Is this on? No. My ass hurts.
Okay, for now, we only have like 20 minutes left, so I think we should take some questions and continue. If you want to respond to each other's talk, you can do it through the questions. Okay, so I will take 3 questions for now for our speakers. Don't be shy. It's okay. It's not only men? Yeah, I mean, that's, Martin is enough.
There's a lady there.
Hello, I'm Laura from Austria. First of all, thank you to the organizers for an amazing panel. It was really, all 3 of you, it was stunning. It was very, very interesting. Thank you. I've recently been thinking a lot about the relation between climate change and climate justice and migration, and I was wondering whether you, all of you, could say a few words on that.
Thank you.
Are we gathering, or you wanna?
We can get one more if there. I can't see anybody now. There is one over there.
Hi, I'm Tinka from Germany. Thank you for the amazing talks and speeches. My question is for the last speaker concerning inclusive, how to be more inclusive, because I have the feeling that the degrowth movement in general is a predominant white movement, and so the question is, how can we make this movement more inclusive and invite also the so-called others? Because I have the feeling that in the degrowth movement, many topics come together, like climate justice, social, like you see it, for example, in the for the demonstration, you can decide for a blog, for if you go to the migration blog or if you go for the animal justice, and but still, even though migration is a big issue nowadays, and it's also addressed in the conference, still, like, it's a very white movement, and I have the feeling that the discourses and needs and interests of minorities are still not reflected in it. So how can the movement become more inclusive?
Okay, there's one.
2 ladies, 1, 2.
See, the questions also are from ladies mostly.
Good evening. My name is Ana Margarida from Portugal. My question is for the last speaker. I found your analysis really impressive. Congratulations, and congratulations for your PhD.
Thank you.
I would like to know if, in your analysis of racialization and racialization, if you approach the question of the combination of race and gender, you know, how gender roles are socially constructed. And to what extent did you notice in your analysis of social policies and employment policies a kind of imposition of a very Swedish idea of what a so-called liberated woman is supposed to act like, what kind of choices is she supposed to make regarding her professional life and her private life as well, and you know, and also specifically Swedish social constructions of, you know, of reproductive and productive work and of the social, and of the gender division of labor. If you notice that kind of imposition of, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I hope I expressed myself well.
Yeah, no,
Thank
I think
I think that would be enough, no?
Do you want to take the M order, like the climate change and migration first?
Yeah, so we can take the questions in order.
Yeah.
The climate justice and migration, inclusiveness in degrowth.
I've got them.
And okay, good.
Which one?
As you like.
Okay. Thank you for your thank you for your question. I think it's a very apt question, given what all three of us are talking about. In my mind, and don't take my word, there are better climate migration scholars out there than me. But what I get from them as well is that the discourse on climate change and migration is almost an eminent example of the things that we're pointing out as problematic here. You'll find the demographic swamping argument there to the extreme, because unlike other regional displacement crises, this is a hypothetical of the future. So you'll see even humanitarian actors, Christian Aid, others have issued reports saying 250 million people will be displaced, and that is interpreted directly by politicians as they're on their way here. And so it becomes this kind of dystopic narrative that unfortunately a lot of so-called left-wing political parties are jumping on very quickly. And as I mentioned as well, a lot of humanitarian movements. It'll go too far here to go into it, but I think we need to look, as you are talking about inclusion, the notion of humanitarianism is also extremely problematic, and its genealogy can be traced back to the abolitionism against the slave trade, but it's also an abolitionism that emerged from within a colonial imperialism. And so there is very much this notion of we intervene to passive individuals in need of rescue that is also, I think, characterizing a lot of climate migration discourses.
I can.
Okay. I was thinking about that when we were talking about the border things. I read an article, Never Waste a Good Crisis. You know, how to make money on people's. It's very good. So how can we be more inclusive? I think that I'll give you a personal answer. Yeah. So I grew up in an environment where I had really nice people with clipboards walking down the street and coming to school and studying us for how could they help us be better people. But they never really questioned the systems that made us be in the situation that we were in. So kind of my research at the start was driven about a kind of anger from white people wanting to be nice, yeah? So I don't think that inclusiveness means being nice. I think it's actually what I try to say has to do with actually doing about the systems. It's not being, nice to someone. It's about to, and I think that then we have to really question what we actually do and not just what we think of ourselves. Yeah, we don't have to have this Facebook, I'm a good person, but go what am I doing when I do things in a certain manner? And I do think that in different settings, I'm not going to generalize, certainly in my circles from the kind of left party, yeah, I feel there's a lack of self-reflection. And, people might agree with me or disagree, and that's great. That's why we have these forums. But I think that there really needs to be, it's not just what we think that we are doing, it's what we actually are doing and how. I'm sure that all the project workers in these projects, I never criticized them. I think the system makes us dependent on certain practices, and we need to question those. That was a very maybe strange answer. To you, I think there are very much, I didn't bring it up now because, 20 minutes and you have to cut, but there's definitely this kind of saving the brown woman from the brown man mentality in this. It's like, you know, you don't know anything about your own wellness and democracy, and so why don't we spend 50 million and move you from one kitchen to another, and you can, yeah, very kind of. I think for me, like brutal racializing and also fundamentally sexist practices, not like explicit again, you know, racializing is one thing, but this kind of the same notion that the Swedish Democrats have is like they also try to use women as a kind of tool for promoting that, you know, some people shouldn't be here and anti-modern and all that. And women are very much, you know, depicted as just mothers, or, you know, they have to stay at home and they have to, you know, we came and liberated them, so now they can, you know, get out of the house and stuff like that. So there's a very, I would say in descriptions, and granted, I haven't studied all the applications ever, this very clear notion of what Spivak would then say, saving the brown woman from the brown man notion. Yes.
Yeah, I would just refer to your comment about inclusiveness in the degrowth movement. I am not misunderstanding you, but I am increasingly critical of the term inclusiveness itself. And this is why I liked very much your analysis, because I think if we have to really ask ourselves, includes people into what exactly? If we want to be an anti-systemic movement, we cannot be inclusive at the same time. Of course, you are talking about including people into the movement, but then I think there is a real problem with the attractiveness of the imperial mode of living precisely to people of the global south. And when they get here, the first they want to do is discover the marvels of consumption. And so if you come and say, okay, we're the degrowth movement, and we want you to consume less, it's somehow a perverse encounter. And this is why, nevertheless, I think that at least in 2015, in Germany, where I had the most contact, there were communitarian experiences of building diverse political communities that also managed to show those people that consumption was not everything, even here, and that other aspects of quality of life were important, but this is also about respect of their experiences, like the experiences people bring, and giving space to their real contributions, and not only, again, including them in what we do anyway.
Yeah, because inclusion, I think, is one of those words like tolerance. It's like, I tolerate you, and like, but per definition, you've already set out the power hierarchies, and just saying that, like, I include you, or it's a very tricky. I don't think it's helpful to seek some kind of social justice to talk in those terms, maybe. Yeah.
Okay, Vasna. Shoot it.
Sorry, I just have to make a quick response to that. As a brown woman from South Africa who has come to live in Sweden, I'm one of those they. I did not come here wanting to grab the Swedish lifestyle. So I think we also have to take a word of caution in who that they is and what their lives are. What I would say is that it's a very diverse group, of course. So I would turn the question around a little bit and not say, how do we include them, but say, what is it about us that doesn't make us want to come there? Because for me, it is a visceral sense of caution that makes me feel like I'm not sure this is my community. And that's then a question back to you of, or to everyone in degrowth, what is it about us that makes it so?
Yeah. You said it much better than I did. Yeah, that's what I mean.
So would you like to respond to that, or should we make that the final words?
I'm fine with final words.
And no, we don't take any questions now.
We're not taking questions.
Is the time off? Let me see. No, but with that comment, I would like to also say that I was also having these contradictions, like to invite people from the refugee community. And they said, Mine, please, I'm so tired of telling my story to people, because what do we get out of it, basically? They know their stories 10 times. They tell it every time whenever people call them. But in the end, they have to go back home. They're still unemployed. They still have to deal with the society's exclusions. So that's one way or another. That's why also that type of inclusion is not really used for them. And thank you for that comment. One more question, okay, because I see one.
We're approaching the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was a product of the defeat of fascism in World War II. Now, my question is there such a thing as universal human rights? And secondly, and who should define it, of course? And secondly, do children in the Global South who are living shorter lives than children, let's say, in Sweden or in Japan, have a human right to reach the same life expectancy that children in the Global North achieve?
All right. I'll just quickly say that that is an excellent question, and I'm not sure I can answer it. Because reading into and examining the birth of the humanitarian movement, like I hinted at before, I would go drive it further back than the Declaration, of course, because the Declaration was based on, for instance, the abolitionist movement and so on. But what that really brings to the foreground is the question whether this is a positive right or a negative right. That is it a right to have something constructed for you, or is it a right to avoid certain deprivations? And I think the moment it turns positive, that is the moment it becomes problematic, historically speaking at least, because that leads the way for those kinds of sticky concepts that you were talking about, and that we've seen unfolded through development narratives and the like. Susan Buck-Morss has written a book called Hegel, Haiti, and Universal History, where she grapples with this question. It's an interesting book. I don't agree with all of the analysis, but she also turns out and sort of contemplates maybe it's only there in the negative. That is, as standards to which we can assess certain practices as not fulfilling. So that's the perhaps part answer from me to your question.
I'm fine. I thought it was funny when you said you were from the activist perspective and from an academic perspective, and I think that academia is an activist. Yeah. It can, so I was going to say that in the beginning, like it can actually be used as a very important activist kind of platform if you're going to be paid to do research, you have to also bring it back and talk about it. And yeah.
Right. So I would like to now wrap up this session, but get a big applause for all our three speakers.